Friends, greetings. I'm here at Myers Park United Methodist Church. We don't make a big deal of it all the time, but we are a United Methodist Church. We're part of a larger connection, a denomination. A lot of people aren't fond of denominations, but I love that we're connected to other Methodists across the city, across the state, across the country, around the world. That's what God's church is supposed to look like. Some people are brand new to Methodism, and so we thought we would give you a little introduction so you can follow things. Sometimes we need reminders of what we're about. You know, what's our DNA? Who are we at our best? Who do we strive to be as Methodists? And then a lot of people know that we got stuff going on in the denomination. You know, it's made the news over the last few years about an impending split in the denomination. So I'm going to guide you through three conversations with people where I'll share, they'll share, we'll converse. The first is with Ryan Danker, who is a great scholar of Methodism. We're going to talk about the origins of this. It began in England back in the 1700s, largely around the life of a guy named John Wesley, also his brother Charles, maybe the greatest hymn writer in history. And they started this renewal movement within the church. They didn't want to start a new denomination, but they started a renewal movement within the church it just caught fire and was so exciting and made such a big difference. And it spread to the colonies and then the early United States. That's why we're here. So that's a big deal. So we're going to look at, what's in the initial stamp of who we are, how we got started. It's really important. The second session, I'm going to share some of, what does it mean to be a Methodist? What are our sort of characteristic thoughts, habits, behaviors? What's at the heart of who we are? I'm going to talk then with a great theologian of Methodism named Beth Felker Jones. You'll really enjoy her. That's going to be great. Third session, going to come back and ask, what's going on now? We've had conferences over the years that you may have heard about. We seem to be moving toward a split in the denomination. And not really right. Just, one group's probably going to exit soon. And my conversation partner, I couldn't pick a better one, would be Bishop Ken Carter. Ken used to be a pastor right here in Charlotte, great friend. He's been really the leading bishop in the church during all of this. And he's coming as our bishop this fall, which is great. And he'll talk to us about what's going on and sort of what it means. You'll learn a lot from that. The important implications for our church. I mean, we're going to be here. We're going to keep being United Methodists. It's going to all be fine. But we need to learn about all this and figure out what's going on. So I hope you'll enjoy this series. And we'll turn now to part one, the origins of Methodism, John Wesley, and such things. Thanks for joining us. Friends, it's my privilege to introduce to you my friend and probably the smartest Methodism Wesley scholar that I know, Ryan Danker. Ryan, thank you for joining us.
Good to be here, James. Thank you.
Ryan and I have a peculiar connection going back a ways that landed the two of us as ushers in George Ragsdale's wedding last fall. That was amazing.
That was great.
And It was great. It was very cool seeing George marry, and it was just a very happy day. And we got to stand up front and be friends of the groom. It was great.
Yeah.
So anyway, Ryan, thanks for joining us. Where are you from originally?
Well, I was born in Portland, Oregon, actually. It's funny. A lot of people don't realize I'm from the West Coast because I've been here on the East Coast for so long. But originally from Oregon, and moved to the East Coast to do divinity work at our alma mater. So at Duke.
Well, that is great. We have some folks where they're trying to learn just some basics about Methodism and refresh what they forgot from when they learned it 5 or 25 years ago. So I just want to talk to you some about sort of the origins of Methodism. A lot of that has to do with this guy named John Wesley. Before we talk about him, just why does one guy matter that much, right? You say John Wesley, boy, he really mattered. How can one guy matter that much?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, he was caught up in a sweeping movement of the Spirit that a lot of people were caught up in. I think he matters because, one, he organized aspects of the revival in ways that other people didn't, which gave it longevity. And two, I mean, I think he was brilliant theologically in his ability to communicate the power of God's transforming love. I mean, that's at the heart of it.
He, probably in his lifetime, George Whitefield was probably the more famous, popular preacher, but Wesley got this thing organized so it became something that could be sustained over time. That's well said. Now, all of history winds up, there's certain personalities that represent something that's going on, people that God raises up and uses in a special way, and Wesley certainly fits that. So Wesley was born in 1703. Mm-hmm. And the first 5 years of his life aren't that interesting. When he's 5 years old, something really interesting happens, right? So they live in the parsonage at Epworth, the rectory, and the house catches on fire. And they got, how many children did the Wesleys have at that time?
Well, lots.
19 or 15 or...
Yeah, they lost count at one point. It seemed.
and they run out of the house, and with that many kids, you got to count heads, and there's one missing, and it's John. They called him Jackie at the time. And his father Samuel knelt, commended his soul to heaven, but then somebody got up on a ladder and got him out of the house.
Yeah, they formed a human ladder actually, it's fascinating that they got him out just in time. I mean, it's quite the story. It almost sounds like a soap opera, but it's true.
And that was a big deal because his mother, Susanna, said she quoted Bible, like she knew the Bible so well she could fish down into Zechariah and say he was a brand plucked from the burning.
Right.
And we have to be especially careful of it. So talk about Wesley's just family life growing up. We know something about his father, but his mother especially was an exceedingly strong, pious woman, right?
Oh yeah, I think they were both very strong and strong-willed, actually. We know that John Wesley was born after the end of a political debate between the two of them. It's funny that Susanna is often, I think United Methodist women have highlighted Susanna wonderfully, and so we know a lot about her. But Samuel was a guy who was a passionate pastor and preacher and teacher and author. I think he wanted to do a lot of things in his life, but politically and just given the situations that he found himself in, he never really made it to the upper echelons where he wanted to be. Epworth, where this is all taking place, was really out in the middle of nowhere. It's still out in the middle of nowhere.
Yes. Sometimes people, we misunderstand some great religious leaders, like that they seem, you can get the image they were godless, and then one day they had a big experience, then they were, the light came on. That's rarely the case, right? So Wesley has this moment in 1738 the Methodists love to talk about. I think they talk about it too much, where Wesley has what's called his Aldersgate experience, and his heart is strangely warmed. I think Americans love that. We're so emotional. For us, religion is such a feeling thing. So, his heart was strangely warmed. I'd like that too. Yeah. Before that, all of his life, Wesley was a very religious person, a very prayerful person, a very holy person, right? I mean, and he'd been a missionary to America already.
Yeah. But it's primitive Christianity. He looked at the early church, the first couple of centuries, and he said, we need to emulate these people in our own time. He wasn't saying we need to mimic them or mirror them in every single respect, but he was saying, look, these people loved Jesus. Let's pay attention to them. Now, then he goes to Georgia and he meets the Moravians, and he does have a crisis of faith because although people, I think they misunderstand this because the Moravians ask him, do you have faith? And he says, well, I hope so, right? But what he was doing was quoting the Book of Common Prayer. He was being an Anglican.
That's right.
But at Aldersgate, he actually has this experience that I think sweeps him into the evangelical movement and gives him an assurance of that faith that he had before. But now he has it like in his bones, right? One of my professors always said about assurance, which is a great Methodist doctrine, right? The question isn't, do you think you're a child of God? Do you know that you know that you know that you're a child of God. And that's, I think, what we see in Aldersgate. And so I think it's a beautiful thing, but we shouldn't make it the pinnacle of his entire existence.
Yeah, and he I mean, he had a heartwarming experience, but that didn't happen like in some vacuum when he was sitting at a pub one night, right? He'd been to prayer that day. He'd been to a small group. He'd heard Martin Luther read aloud. He'd sung hymn. He'd done a lot of stuff, right? So, Wesley later in his life, he says, I'm not worried that Methodism is going to cease to exist. I am worried, though, that we'll have the form of religion without the power. It's almost like Wesley knew, right? Because he knew the form of religion, but he hadn't really discovered the power, the joy that could be in that. And some of that, you mentioned the Moravians. That is cool. Wesley came as a missionary to Oglethorpe's colony there in Savannah. You can all, by the way, if you go to downtown Savannah, my people, you know this. There's a statue of John Wesley there in a square.
Yeah, Reynolds Square.
Yeah. So last time Lisa and I were there, we're standing there, and there are 3 other couples standing there looking at Wesley. And I said, "Are you guys Methodist preachers?" And they all said, "Yeah." Like, who else is going to do this, right? But anyway, he came there, and it went really badly. He was not good at being a missionary, but it was on that ship journey home there, and they're being tossed at sea, and he's scared to death. But he sees these Moravians, and he's really moved by them, right?
Oh, he is, yeah.
Wesley had an amazing career because he lived till 1791 from that 1738 moment. That's a long time. I love the way he died. He hadn't spoken for a while, and then he quotes an Isaac Watts hymn, "I'll praise my maker while I have breath." And he was nearly broke when he died. He only had enough money left to arrange for his burial. That's just classic Wesley, right?
Right.
Because his is a life that's very dedicated to God. Methodists probably wouldn't want to hear much about John Wesley and money. Man, he was deadly serious about your money is God's, not some tenth of it, but all of it.
Yeah.
He was rigorous about everything in the faith. We take all of this very, very seriously. So he started this movement. He preached all over the place and got people organized in small groups. Talk some about why Methodism, like why it got hot in those days, and there was opposition to it though also, right? Not everybody was jazzed up the Methodists had showed up.
No. In fact, a lot of people thought they were dangerous, but why did it catch is a great question. And I think there are a number of reasons. I've written some long pieces on this. I'll try to summarize it here. What we find with Methodists is that I love how John Walsh from Oxford actually says it. He said, "You'll often find the Methodists in the early period just beyond the peal of church bells." We think of the Victorians and the Edwardians, right? The British and their reserve. They still have it today, don't they? In the 18th century, they were an emotional people. And all of a sudden, here you have a form of Christianity that embraces that emotionalism. And you think of the hymns of Charles Wesley. They're very emotional. Why? Because Charles Wesley was a very emotional and passionate man.
Oh.
And so all this talk of love, of heart religion, of assurance, of experience, all these things catches certain aspects of British culture outside the reach of the church. And that's really the kind of group we're talking about. Now, people have said, well, mainly the Methodists were poor. Not necessarily. There was a higher percentage of poor and a higher percentage of rich in Methodism. It was an interesting group. Now, because of that, by the way, the small groups actually worked because the rich were then able to help the poor intimately within those small groups because they actually knew them. That was one of the things about Methodism too.
But there was real mixing of rich and poor. Like it's not something we see often in church life today. And they had all that religion of the heart that was appealing, but it also had a discipline and a structure. Like there was something that you could latch onto and get stuff done. I mean, I've read these things that you can tell me if it's true, is that where Methodism caught fire, there were like lower rates of alcoholism and unemployment. Like people's lives actually improved because of this religion that had taken root in their lives.
Right, and because of the methodical expectations of maintaining your membership. mean, this is something the modern Methodists would cringe at, but the Wesley brothers would go around and kick people out of the societies on a regular basis because they weren't following the rules. John visited one society and kicked out 147 people for what he said, general laziness.
We don't have any lazy Christians in my church. That's not a problem.
Not a one. And I think we have to remember Methodism wasn't a church, right? Methodism was a renewal movement within the Church of England.
Wesley didn't want to start a new church.
No. But because it was a renewal movement, only the really committed should be in it. He thought, well, if you don't really want to attend the meetings, if you don't want to keep up the disciplines, if you don't want to confess your sins, fine. Then this isn't for you.
And the real backbone of that, we try to get people to do small groups, and they tend to think, ooh, that'd be fun, meet some people or whatever. But for them, the small group was the accountability mechanism in this life of faith, in this pursuit of holiness, which you held one another accountable, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because, right, the great doctrine of Methodism is Christian perfection, right? Being so filled with the love of God that sin no longer reigns in the heart. And I think in most American minds, we think, oh, that must have happened at an altar call in a big setting because a preacher has given you an impassioned sermon. Actually, the sermons of early Methodism were to call people to faith, right? They were really for sinners to come to repentance. That's what the majority of the sermons are about. Now, the printed ones go into greater depth, but the sermons that were preached over and over again. But if you were awakened by Methodist preaching, if you wanted to experience this forgiveness, then what Wesley and his brother and his preachers would do is they'd put you in a class. And the class would actually be an intensive kind of small group. It's not a Bible study, but an intensive group where they're going to ask each other, have you sinned today or this week? What have you done?
You could always say, no, I haven't.
Yeah.
Wrong answer.
My favorite question from the list of questions in those groups is, was your first thought this day, was your first thought upon God? Right? The very moment you woke up, was your first thought upon God? And of course, the small groups weren't simply about accountability. Although, let me say, if you're wondering why I brought up Christian perfection, it's within those accountability groups that people experienced that wholeness that Wesley talked about. But also, it's within those small groups that they did something that I love the phrase, they watched over one another in love. And because they knew each other, right? We mentioned the rich and the poor being together. Well, you got to see that Betty was in need, and so you helped Betty. Or Betty could see that John was in need, and so Betty helped John. They really watched over one another in love, and there's beautiful narratives about that.
I know over their bodies and material needs, but also over their souls. I care about you not because you're fun or neat, but I care about your holiness. I care about your prayerfulness. I care about, yeah. I bet people today crave that, but they don't know they crave it.
Probably.
They think that would be mortifying, but actually they'd love that, right? Accountability.
Yeah, I think at first it's kind of scary.
Yeah.
And I think, there's some similarities with Roman Catholic idea of confession, right? Teaching in seminaries, I've had the opportunity to teach. I have 8 former students. By the way, they didn't start out Methodist. 8 former students who are now priests in the Catholic Church. And they're always going on about how confession is so liberating. They're trying to tell their people that confession is liberating. And I think it is. And not just in the Catholic way, but, confess your sins one to another, right? As the scripture says. And I think people found freedom in that in Methodism. There's an authenticity in early Methodism. It's not put on your best suit or dress or whatever and go to church and pretend like everything's okay. You couldn't get away with that.
Well, I'd love to for us to recover some of that real quickly, Ryan. This is super fascinating. So this religion that started, this movement, this renewal movement that started in England and the United Kingdom, came to America, and it was a big deal in colonial and then post-revolutionary America into the early 1800s. Why did it work so well here, do you think?
Yeah, it worked really well here. I mean, it's hard for us to fathom how well it worked. In fact, so my doctoral advisor was David Hempton, and he actually calculated, leave it to the social historians, that if Methodist growth from 1784 to 1844, right, that's the founding of the established Methodist Church here, and then the first major split, well, or third, anyway, the North and South split. If Methodist growth had continued as it had for that period all the way to 1900, there would have been more Methodists in America than human beings. So, I mean, so when we're talking about growth, yes, exponential growth. Why did it work so well? A number of reasons. I think one, the American experiment opened up avenues for people to better themselves. And obviously, we're still working on, how can the American experiment allow everybody to participate in that? I'm well aware. But there was this sense of freedom in the American experiment that I think actually meshed well with the Methodist claim that God can perfect you in this life. There's this inherent optimism to Methodism and to the American experiment. The circuit riders went out and they were with the pioneers. They weren't, this is one reason why, because, okay, let's be honest, Methodism and the Episcopal Church, they're cousins. They're both forms of Anglicanism in a certain sense. Why did one grow so massively and the other grew somewhat, but not entirely? Well, Methodists were able to move. There was movement in Methodism, and it wasn't just the itinerancy. The whole thing was movable.
Yeah, we weren't protecting big old institutional churches. We were on horseback. We were in communities that weren't even built up yet.
Right, and we had a flexible structure to our conferences. We had a flexible understanding of appointments. We had, flexibility and Methodism went hand in glove. And if you needed a preacher, well, send him, right? And later, send her. And so there was this concept. So you had this optimism combined with this flexibility that really meshed well in the American context. Now, so around 1815 or so, and maybe sometimes a little earlier, you see the great camp meeting revivals that sweep the country. Well, the Methodists saw that and they grabbed hold of it. I know we think the Baptists came up with the altar call, but it's not true.
No. And that revival movement, that's interesting. That the Methodist, the strength of early Methodism in America, it was a revivalist thing, but then it also, the communities were left behind. People have trouble picturing this, that people you didn't see a lot of people in rural America. Like, people were spread out, and what the church provided, among other things, this heart, we love God, we're loved by God, we're getting better as people, we're becoming holier, but also community. Here are people that will love us and support us. That was huge out on the frontier.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the Methodists were able to provide community. Because until 1901, you were still required in most Methodist branches to be in a class meeting.
Yeah.
Now, that didn't mean that they were doing it, but it was still in the books. Respectability killed the class meeting, I think, because we didn't want to force our more affluent members into these groups.
Well, and I think it's akin to to me, the wonder of Methodism. On the one hand, we have things like liturgy, a hymnal, a formal order of service, but yet you've got that pulsating heart, passion kind of thing going on, right? It's both. It's not one or the other. It's both.
Right.
And that's the beauty, I think, of what we do. What would you say, this is my last question, kind of thinking of the birth of Methodism, what's like the most striking, beautiful thing about it?
That's an interesting question. I really think the most striking and beautiful thing about Methodism is the doctrine of perfection. I really think it is, and I know that many contemporary Methodists have probably never heard that word in their local churches, but it's a beautiful idea, and I think a wonderful expectation that God actually wants to transform each and every one of us, not to make us anything different necessarily, but to make us really who we were meant to be, which is freed by the love of God, to live the life that God has intended for each and every one of us. I mean, sometimes as a movement, we slipped into legalism in order to move toward perfection, but it's not legalism, it's freedom. And Wesley often used the term freedom and happiness to describe perfection because, and he was Aristotelian, and he's right, he's coming from Aristotle. And Aristotle says happiness is actually true fulfillment of who you are supposed to be. And who does God want us to be? He wants us to be freed from the shackles of sin, from the disease of sin, so that we can live lives of happiness and fulfillment and contentment in relationship with God, with one another, and even with the creation itself. And I think that's a beautiful vision.
That's beautifully put. I'm glad you named that. I was thinking about this recently. The Bible talks about perfection. You shall be perfect. I mean, it's a common theme.
Yeah.
And we get confused about it, right? Because we tend to think we have this adjective perfectionism, which is kind of a prissy, can't make a mistake kind of thing. But the word perfect, if you think about it, Robert's was where you perfect a motion, you're improving it, you're making it truer, go back to ancient, Latin, other words, teleos, perfect. It really means more like mature and finding its true purpose, which you were naming there. Well, I heard an old preacher years ago say, some people ask about going on to perfection, and my question is, if you're not going there, where are you going? It's just a great. Brian, thank you. Love that. You want to go on to perfection.
Yeah.
Brian, thank you for joining us. This has been informative and inspiring, and on behalf of my people, thank you for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been great.
It was fascinating to learn about John Wesley. He's in the stained glass window here at the back of our church. And Wesley is right here when you walk into church every Sunday. You walk right past him. You may not have noticed. Wesley's everywhere with us. We're going to look at that more next week. I've got a great guest coming, Beth Felker-Jones, great theologian, teaches at Northern Seminary up in Illinois. She's just really wise. We're going to talk about sort of the hallmarks of Methodism. What do we think? How do we act? What are we about? I hope you'll join us for this and think more about Wesley and his ongoing influence on us, the Methodists.